The Hegelian Dialectic. What is it? Is it problem, reaction, solution? Who was Hegel? What's a dialectic? Well, to give you a little bit of information before we get into this conversation, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher that lived from 1770 to 1831. Now, a dialectic is a discourse between two or more people holding different points of view about a subject, but wishing to establish the truth through reasoned arguments. Now, how is the term Hegelian dialectic commonly used today? Well, the Hegelian dialectic is typically described as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is morphed into problem, reaction, solution. Did Hegel create a dialectic? Well, no. Aristotle said that it was the pre-Socratic philosopher Zeno of Elea who invented dialectic. Well then, did Hegel create problem, reaction, solution? From my research, it appears that it was David Icke who popularized the problem, reaction, solution. So what exactly is Hegel's connection to the Hegelian dialectic? I'm Ali from That's What the F Happens. Let's see what the F is happening with the Hegelian dialectic.
Most difficult philosophers to read, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel attempted to expand on many of the ideas of Kant. Due to the density of his works and the fact that he used many words he invented himself, there is a certain degree of controversy over what exactly is meant by many of Hegel's claims.
Welcome back to episode 6 of That's What the F Happens. I'm one of your hosts, Ali. And today we're going to be talking about, well, Clay, why don't you introduce yourself and introduce the topic?
Co-host here, Clay. And let me just say, I think from here going forward, the more appropriate name for That's What the F Happens, it should be That's What the F Happens, down the rabbit hole, because that's what we're doing. Every episode is just
going down the rabbit hole.
Down the rabbit hole. Alice. So, most of our rabbit holes begin with our conversations, and I believe, based on past conversations, some that appeared on earlier episodes, we came to this discussion of what you identified as the Hegelian dialectic, which I had no awareness of, but I understood the concept. I understood that it's something that has played out in our lives on numerous occasions. And what I'm speaking of is this phenomenon in which what we'll call the powers that be, the elite, those that
powers that shouldn't be,
powers that shouldn't be, those that have the means and ability to influence everyone's lives across the world. What they do is they unleash a set of actions that follows a very formulaic unfolding. And it's, you create a problem, you get everybody to react in the predictable way that you know that they're going to react, and then you swoop in like the white knight as the hero,
solution,
a savior. And it's just I may be jumping ahead of myself here, but we've seen, for example, one of the more famous instances is, people feel that 9/11 was in many ways orchestrated.
When I heard about the attacks on 9/11, I immediately saw it as an absolute classic example of what I termed over many years problem, reaction, solution. This is a devastating technique of mass manipulation where you create a problem, blame someone else for it, in this case, Osama bin Laden. You tell the public through an unquestioning, pathetic media, mainstream, the version of that problem you want the public to believe. And that's another classic. That's exactly what's happened over 9/11. All this period, Brian, of going around the world, of researching 9/11, I have not yet come across one serious mainstream documentary investigating 9/11 and asking questions about the official story. If that is a coincidence and an accident, then I've got some seafront property in the Midwest that I might like to buy. So with problem, reaction, solution, you create the problem, you tell the public the version of the problem that you want them to believe, and you want their reaction. My goodness me, and understandably so, 9/11 is a perfect example. You want fear, you want outrage, you want a reaction of something must be done, this can't go on, what are they going to do about it? And then those who have covertly created the problem and blame someone else, got that reaction, do something, then openly offer the solutions to the problems they have themselves created, which are changes in society, which advance their agenda. And because of 9/11, that's why I call it the trigger. 9/11 was the trigger of a sequence of events still unfolding, which has led to mass murder mayhem in the Middle East, as country after country was picked off, all pre-9/11 listed, by the way, by the people that really did it, and has led to a ever-gathering destruction of basic civil liberties, basic privacy, and the justification of surveillance, mass surveillance on the public.
You can be the extreme conspiracy theorist and say that 9/11 was an inside job, they meant to bring down the Twin Towers. Even if you don't take that approach, even if you say that's nutty, that's tin hat, that's whatever your superlative is for that sort of theory, even in the more per se regular world in which you say, okay, well, what was our reaction? We and what was leading up to that? We had a burning desire to be involved in the Middle East and the affairs of countries in the Middle East, to take down Saddam Hussein. There were all these efforts and plans that had been put in place long before 9/11 that, thanks to 9/11,
that targeted certain countries that we eventually went after. So really, I mean, to kind of further build on what you were talking about, the problem does not have to be necessarily created. You can just also just take advantage of a naturally occurring problem and offer the solution. But the key part to this whole thing is the media.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who's in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When you talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right. Professor Chomsky, Noam, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through on its way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. Begins to sound like it says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one. Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start. This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours. He really knows how to time it.
He's got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay. And they do this in all sorts of ways. By selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in society.
Is the media. Without the media covering something ad infinitum over and over and over again, and to get the people fed up because it's usually stuff that doesn't even really affect the people, but they have to get so fed up that they say, what are they gonna do about it? What are they gonna do about it? And then that's the opportunity to offer this the solution. So really, I just wanted to go into real quick that the idea is problem, reaction from the people, from the masses, solution from those who sought to exploit the problem, and a dialectic. So what I wanted to kind of go into was just first of all, Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian is for this philosopher named Hegel.
Hegel was born in Germany in 1770 to a relatively well-off family. His mother died, though, when he was young from a fever. When in seminary school, he became friends with two significant figures in their own right, Friedrich Hölderlin, and a poet, who was a poet, and Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, soon to be a significant philosopher. After spending some time tutoring, Hegel came to Jena at his friend's invitation, where he taught until Napoleon came through. He eventually taught at the University of Heidelberg, and after served as the chair and later rector of the University of Berlin. He left Berlin due to his weak health during a cholera outbreak, but returned before the disease had run its course and died soon after.
He really never particularly came up with a dialectic. Dialectic is something where you have a thesis, which is like an idea that reaches its logical extremity, which would be the antithesis, which is the contradiction. And then when they finally, the dialectic is the people go back and forth, thesis, antithesis, back and forth, until they reach what's known as a synthesis. So
existence.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now the what I found, what I was telling Clegg, what I found so interesting is that these so-called Hegelian dialectics, also known as problem, reaction, solutions, are not dialectics at all, because there is no back and forth using logic to try to discover the truth. It's actually just being used as a means to an end. The truth doesn't matter. In fact,
I think you need to highlight that's the essence of a dialectic. Is it's the desire for truth and seeking truth through that back and forth. The discourse is a crucial element, right, to a dialectic. Is there has to be the back and forth and an earnest desire for the two components, the two participants, to use that back and forth, the thesis and antithesis, to creep towards that synthesis, the synthesis being the truth. And it's done earnestly, honestly, and with truth being the ultimate goal.
What is the dialectic? This is a quotation from Plato's Republic, Book 7, from Part 354c. Then doesn't the same apply to the good? If a man can't define the form of the good and distinguish it clearly in his account from everything else, and then battle his way through all objections, determined to give them refutation based on reality and not opinion, and come through his own argument unshaken, you wouldn't say he knew what the good in itself was, or indeed any other good. Any shadowy notion such a man gets hold of is the product of opinion rather than knowledge, and his living in a dream from which he will not awake on this side of the other world, where he will finally sleep forever. So the dialectic makes it possible to pick apart arguments to find where true knowledge lies. Dialectic is useful in separating knowledge or facts from opinion. Knowledge becomes evidence when placed in the context of an argument. The dialectic or dialogue is an argument, a debate, in which one hears a point and subsequent counterpoint, and in that way they come to know the truth of the matter.
So it's, if you like to think of it as such, to me it feels like it's a very pure process when done right, when done for the right reasons.
Right. So, the Plato, the Aristotles of the world used to use the dialectic, in ancient Greece to try to discover the truth, in an attempt to discover the truth. But what we have here is something that's a misnomer. It's called the Hegelian dialectic, but yet Hegel never used it. Hegel particularly did not even agree with the idea of a synthesis.
Now, of all the important things in Hegel, the method is the most important. Most know and call Hegel's method by the name dialectics. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer. One, because Hegel never called his method dialectics, and second is because dialectics are just one aspect of his method. Now, we could blame Hegel for all the terrible misinterpretations of his philosophy, thanks to the fact that he wrote terribly, or at least some people claim he wrote terribly. I don't think he's so bad. But if you did that, I think you'd be wrong. Because there actually is one work in which the method is absolutely clear and just cannot be misunderstood, and that is in the science of logic. Hegel tells us in the prefaces to the Phenomenology and in the prefaces to the Science of Logic that his method is not formulaic, it cannot be formalized, and that is that.
Through this rabbit hole that we got down, a few things occurred to me. I like to think of myself as someone that actively seeks truth, that actively applies logic and reasoning to my thought to settle on conclusions. And in many instances, when I'm having discourse with friends and we begin to talk politics, society, I often reach this conclusion that the only solution is just absolute removal from society, to escape, off the grid would be the real world example of this, to move off the grid, to just remove yourself from society, because you will not get that desired solution despite all your efforts to apply thesis and antithesis, the only conclusion is, okay, well, I can't be part of this society. And that was frequently a result in a lot of dialectics, to my understanding, is that there wouldn't always be this nice solution wrapped up in a bow. Through logic and reasoning and discourse, the two sides would often settle on something effectively apparently contradiction factors heavily into this, right? So there are often that, according to the dialectics, when you reach the point of contradiction, you had to abandon the whole argument, correct? And just start from square one again, so to speak. And maybe you could illuminate me a little bit more on that. But effectively, that's what it feels like when I say, oh well, let's just go off the grid. You get so far in your logic and reasoning to the point where you are abandoning all the premises and just saying, well, screw this, I'm just going to go off the grid. And that would be effectively the contradiction where you go back to square one, at least to my thinking. But my understanding is that Hegel said that's unsatisfactory. I cannot accept that a problem can end in this sort of contradiction and whatnot, where we haven't settled on a solution. And it seems to me that his belief was that there would always be a solution, and there always could be a
well,
solution.
but the back and forth, I mean, when I was like studying the Hegel, the back and forth I eventually thought was infinite, that you would never actually reach a synthesis. You would just always have this back and forth between whatever the thesis was and the contradiction, because German idealism is a lot about the contradiction, that the contradiction has to exist.
Oh,
in the human mind, because any sort of object only exists in its relation to the human mind. But eventually, and this is what that Antonio Wolff was saying, you go back and forth so many times that eventually you reach sublation, where it's something new, but it still has some components of both the thesis and the antithesis, but then it eventually goes back and points to something within itself. So there is eventually some resolution. But we should point out that Hegel was probably the most difficult philosopher to understand. His writing was known to be horrible, and even philosophers or people who study philosophy have a hard time understanding Hegel. And then that's why there's a couple of schools of thought that I had to, like, why did they call it a Hegelian dialectic when Hegel didn't really agree with dialectics per se? He, first of all, never said problem, reaction, solution. He never came up with the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He actually didn't even agree with synthesis. I came to the idea that it was called a Hegelian dialectic because he was so hard to understand.
That in and of itself.
That in of itself was they're like, oh, we're doing some crazy stuff, problem, reaction, solution. The average person won't be able to understand it. It's too complicated. Because Hegel was so complicated, now they're like, this dialectic or this practice, this means to an end, the average person is not going to understand.
Well,
now, I also did see that they said that it was a misinterpretation of the Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, triad that was popularized by Chalabaus. So it was a misinterpretation as well, but I also kind of thought Hegel's just so confusing that it's easy just to be like, oh yeah, this is what Hegel said. And then people are like, well, I mean, I guess it's translated from German, but it's hard to understand. German idealism in general is kind of hard to understand.
It does have a feel a bit of, like the
mysticism.
Well, no, like bureaucracy in the United
States. Right, well, and also that was the other thing. Since he was such a statist, that maybe Hegelian dialectic is something to empower the state because he was such a statist.
Well, I have to confess that for me, the more watered down problem, reaction, solution, it's much easier to wrap your head around, and it's much easier to find real world application.
Technique, a mind manipulation technique that I've called in my books problem, reaction, solution. And it works like this. If you want to introduce something, say centralization of power through the United Nations, centralization of power militarily with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the biggest military organization in the world that's expanding all the time. If you want to centralize power into fewer and fewer hands, if you did that openly and said this is what we want to do, there'd be a reaction against that. People would say, hey, this is a fascist state you want to create. We're not having this. But through this technique of problem, reaction, solution, you can actually manipulate people to demand you do what you want to do anyway. So it works like this. First of all, you create the problem, but you get someone else to be blamed for it. You then report that problem through the media in the way you want it reported, because the media is owned by the same people that own the banks and etc. You get the public to react to your problem by saying something must be done, this can't go on, what are they going to do about it? And at that point, they, who have covertly created the problem and blame someone else, who've gleaned that reaction of do something, then offer the solution to the problems they have created. So if you take the world wars, after the First World War, in which the financial centers of London and Wall Street, etc., funded all sides, power on this planet was in fewer hands than ever before. After the Second World War, it was even fewer hands.
Recognize that it's
right.
all around us, and
100%. And I said that on the Instagram story when I was just like, the problem, reaction, solution is super simplistic compared to trying to understand Hegel's himself's philosophy.
Well, and I mean, it is an indictment, I think, of all of us, because I think at one time or another, we're all guilty of this in some form. I internalize this and personalize it for myself in the sense that I think about some of the beliefs that I have, some of the things that I'll give you the examples that I shared earlier with you. I'm a Bernie Sanders fan. I'm a fan of the idea of Medicare for all.
Under the legislation that I have offered, every family in America would receive comprehensive coverage. All basic health care needs are covered, and in the process, middle-class families would save thousands of dollars a year by eliminating their private insurance costs as we move to a publicly funded program.
And what is that born out of? It's born out of a problem, reaction, solution mentality.
Yeah, it is.
We have a problem. People are underinsured.
Go to the doctor.
They can't go to the doctor. They can't afford it. They can't afford to be taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. Well, my reaction is, this is outrageous. This is the United States. We're the most powerful country with, the usual.
We're the best. We the best.
Yeah, we the
DJ
best.
Khaled.
DJ Khaled, MAGA, all
we're
that.
We're like the DJ Khaled of countries.
So there's the problem. There's my reaction, And then you've got the Bernie Sanders of the world and others who say, well, the solution is Medicare for all. Everyone should be covered. And it feels like a solution. It seems like it would work. It still appeals to me, but having one looked at it through a new light based on just this conversation and then discussing that knee-jerk reaction, that problem reaction solution really is. And also there have been creeping doubts in my mind, and the coronavirus actually is a good test case for where my metal as far as Medicare, Medicaid for all, how much I'm willing to defend that idea. The way I see people react to this crisis,
Tensions flared at Woolworths Chullora around 7 o'clock this morning when 3 women became involved in a toilet paper tussle.
I just want one pack. No, not one pack.
Staff rushed to aisle 11 to intervene.
Yeah, it's unfair. You need to stop. Call the police. I'm calling the police.
Everything from running to stores and buying up all the toilet paper in the world to the absolute terror and let's shut ourselves indoor and you should be ashamed of yourself if you're not locked up inside and you're potentially exposing people.
And also, like, if you're just not absolutely terrified of dying, then there's something wrong with you.
Well, I mean, it cuts a lot of ways, but I guess for me, what the coronavirus scare or whatever adjectives you'd like to tack on there or noun, whatever you call it, what I'm seeing is that it does make me question our humanity, it does make me question the idea of I should be going to bat for other humans in the way that I often feel like I should, like the compassion that I like to extend to people and the desire for their well-being to be on part of my own. I do have moments where I question that, and so that's the combination of this. Well, we have this new awareness that I've discovered through our rabbit hole of this frequent recurrence of the problem reaction solution, the Hegelian dialectic, as they like to call it for whatever reason. And
as Noam Chomsky also refers to it, the manufacturing of consent.
Which I think, by the way, all credit to Noam Chomsky, his method of explaining the phenomenon, as well as his ability to tie the pieces together and demonstrate, for our world, our nation, it's so much more more relatable and tangible to me. And like you said, yes, that manufactured consent, and to a certain degree, that's what it is. When going back to what I was getting at is that, hey, manufactured consent is effectively they put the idea in your head and then you decide that that's your idea, and manufactured consent, right? And is that how Medicare for all becomes a reality? You can have the Hegelian dialectic, the problem reaction solution, at the 30,000 foot level, the elite of the elite that are pulling the strings above everyone. And then you can have the 15,000 foot view where it's the party system. Part of how that party system works is each party has to
sell their product.
Exactly. And we've, the problem reaction solution is one way to go about that. Is it's well, we'll sell you something once we've convinced you that that's what you want, right? That's the informed, because I came here to buy this.
Right.
You know, like, why are you here? Well, you know, somewhere something was planted in the back of my brain, and it compelled me to come here and be like, this is what I really want. And that's what the parties are doing. But that they're at odds. And so, I mean, that just because there's a conflict there and an agreement on whether we should have Medicare for all or not, does not mean that for one side of that political equation that isn't the method they're using to push it upon people. And you know, if you're a Republican, that's essentially how you feel. You feel like you're being you're having this agenda force fed on you to have everybody on the government tit, to have everybody relying on welfare effectively for their livelihood and survival. So interestingly enough, that's sort of the
universal basic income that we've been talking about in other episodes.
And here's the thing, man, is that I think that that's something that, based on these conversations, based on the rabbit hole we've gotten down, the conversations we've had, is this has all made me have or give pause to everything that I thought I wanted, everything that and I mean politically, I mean personally, you know, it really has me analyzing, wait a minute, when did it first enter my mind that, you know, Medicare for all was desirable, or the universal basic income was there? And these are ideas that have a lot of allure to me. But at the same time, in both cases, there are doubts that have existed even before. And I think that's a big takeaway for me, and I think that's the dialectic existing within our own heads.
It's like the thesis and antithesis within.
Well, exactly. Like, it's our mind has the capability and the consciousness and the awareness to even hint to you, like, wait a minute, like, there's another side to this, that there's things you should doubt. But
that's the other thing. What I think is possible, maybe happening, is with this ultimate in government control right now, more government control than we've ever experienced in our life. Mm-hmm. Now you think about, well, what if government had control over whether if I could go to the doctor? What if government had control over my income, telling me that I can get only this basic income, which I've always said, people are not going to want basic income because they're used to disposable income.
Yeah.
So then when you start really thinking about what you'd be giving up for these things, and in fact, when we realize that people need the healthcare system is so strained because people have terrible lifestyle choices. So they have a whole slew of metabolic diseases that really just puts a lot of stress on the healthcare system.
And they're onset by those people themselves.
Right. Because there's money in it. Because there's money to be made. You know, but I mean, there's other solutions.
Well, it's partially, yes, that we as humans, we are fed a healthy diet of unhealthy shit, so to speak, right? So, and we're exposed to. I mean, you shared that video with me of I had no fucking idea they were spraying Miami when the Zika virus was in full effect.
Colonies in Somerville wiped out after aerial spraying of a pesticide to kill mosquitoes.
I have an apiary here with 46 hives of bees. Well, I did have. Now I have boxes.
This yard used to be filled with a golden glow because of the amount of bees. Today, it's nearly empty.
We have to be kind and compassionate and figure out what's going to work, what's going to be the best methods to treat anything without harming the honeybees.
We spoke to bee owners who say they're devastated.
I was angry that day. I mean, it just didn't make any, I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that we spray poison from the sky.
But they want this to be a teaching moment.
And you can point fingers and blame everybody. That's not going to accomplish anything. But if we turn this into a teachable moment, that how important bees are to the environment, how unhealthy it is to aerial spray.
Even though there were mistakes made and balls dropped on this, I don't feel like anybody did this in a malicious way to harm my bees.
They believe this problem goes beyond the bees.
Autism's on a rise. Bees are on a decline. Is it coincidental? I don't think so.
That blew my mind. That flew completely under the radar for me. But it's funny. This is a tangent of sorts, but it's funny to see all the parallels there and how that's just disappeared from the radar.
The fact that there even is like a Hegelian dialectic, and if you look it up, there's like all these videos and articles about it. I mean, that's inspiring because people are out here questioning the official narrative. Because really, in order for the Hegel, a quote unquote, I'm going to stop calling it Hegelian dialectic, for a problem reaction solution scheme to work, people need to accept the official narrative. But there's plenty of people out there that are not accepting that official narrative, and that's inspiring. Those are the people that I look to.
Coincidentally, all those people are most likely the targets of some sort of discrediting effort.
For sure.
So
For
it's
sure.
like, well, these are, like the author of Behold the Pale Horse.
Yeah, William Cooper. He was murdered.
I feel like that's a good place to end right there because we're getting off to what could be a new episode. But I will tell you, your Zika virus video has the bees.
Oh, they're intentionally killing the bees. Intentionally.
That needs to be a topic for future conversation. So let's drop this here, and we'll exchange text, phone calls, and all that.
For sure. Well, thank you again for tuning in to episode 6 of That's What the F Happened. We were talking about the Hegelian dialectic. I don't want to call it that anymore. We'll just call it problem, reaction, solution as a tactic and a strategy. Clay, any last words on the problem, reaction, solution?
I have one last thought that occurs to me that's sort of amusing and ironic considering. This podcast is effectively a problem, reaction, solution. We're stuck in quarantine.
That was the problem.
Yes. So what was our reaction and what was the solution? Ponder on that, folks.
That's what the F happened.
That's what the F happened.